The ballroom smelled like victory, a heady mix of champagne and polished mahogany, threaded through with the faint tang of my father's cologne resting in the air like a subtle reminder of legacy. I raised my glass when Roman's baritone voice carried over the mic, to my soulmate, the one who helped build everything beside me. I felt the warmth of pride flood my chest as I met Amara's eyes. She sat poised beside my brother, lips curved in a smile so practiced it rivaled any movie star's. The applause swelled, a tidal wave of approval that lapped at the edges of my confidence. My cheeks flushed, not with embarrassment, but with the certainty that this moment was supposed to belong to me as well. But then Roman shifted his weight, extended his arm, and with a flourish I'd never seen before, pointed at Amara. Surprise, she's marrying me. Applause crashed over me like shards of glass. Camera flashes exploded in my vision, each strobe freezing my heartbeat in mid-thump. People rose from their seats, toasting the couple with a fervor I'd expected would be reserved for me and Amara. I realized I was still clutching my glass, the cool stem trembling under trembling fingers. I lowered it slowly, hearing the faint clink of crystal against crystal, the sound echoing in my hollow chest. My mind struggled to catch up, to process that the woman I loved, the woman I thought loved me, had been co-opted, weaponized in a declaration of conquest by the only person I trusted more than anyone else in the room. My world stopped, a still photograph of betrayal and disbelief. Amara stood, her posture regal under the ballroom's glittering chandeliers. She didn't flinch. She didn't recoil. She held her head high, as though she'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. The laughter around me felt cruel, like a private joke for everyone but me. She raised her own glass. Perfectly still, perfectly composed, and turned toward me, lips parting in a smile that sent a cold shiver through my spine. Then, with a voice as calm and theatrical as a seasoned actress, she said, "I have my own announcement." The applause stuttered and died, replaced by the hush that falls when a bomb is about to drop. Every eye in the room landed on her, then bounced to me, as though I were an object on display, waiting to be judged. My pulse thundered in my ears, the only sound I could hear above the soft scrape of chairs and the quiet murmur of confusion. Amara held the room in her gaze for a moment that felt suspended in time. Then she tilted her chin, her smile sharpening like a blade, and spoke words that cut deeper than any blow I could have anticipated. "Your inheritance? Your company shares? You signed them over 3 weeks ago, remember?" Heat surged through me, a wildfire of anger, panic, and grief. I tasted bitterness on my tongue, metallic and bright. My breath caught as memories flooded back, late nights by my hospital bed, delirium clouding my thoughts. My hand forced to sign stacks of documents under the guise of refinancing property. Her voice echoed that deceit, each syllable a confirmation of the worst betrayal. Roman's laughter bubbled up behind me, a triumphant sound that made my blood run cold. But when I turned to look at our mother, her expression had shifted from surprise to something unreadable. Fear? Guilt? I couldn't tell. Her gaze flicked from Amara to me, and in that instant, I saw the fracture in her loyalties. The party that was meant to celebrate love, family, and prosperity had morphed into an execution of trust. Every face in the room felt like an actor in a play I didn't know I was auditioning for. Glasses clinked in forced solidarity, meaningless echoes against the truth of their complicity. I realized then that they weren't just taking Amara. They were taking everything my father built, my future, my birthright, my very identity. The framed photographs lining the walls, the oversized floral arrangements dripping with orchids and lilies, even the golden fork pressed into my trembling fingers. All of it felt grotesque, a staged backdrop for my ruin. My palms went slick with sweat as the weight of their conspiracy settled on my shoulders. I swallowed hard, tasting salt and humiliation. The room continued to revolve, a carousel of smug faces and amused onlookers, oblivious or indifferent to the pain they inflicted. And then, as if performing some final act of cruelty, Amara raised her glass again, her eyes never leaving mine, and offered a toast of her own, to new beginnings. The words rang in my ears, hollow and mocking. I lowered my gaze and watched the lascivious sparkle in the champagne catch the light, each bubble a tiny mirror reflecting my shattered world. I lifted my glass anyway, because manners demanded it, because my upbringing had taught me decorum even in the face of ruin. I sipped the bitter liquid, feeling it burn its way down my throat, anchoring me to the brutal reality of the moment. When I set the glass down, the echo of its placement on the marble table sounded like a verdict. My eyes glided over the crowd one last time, registering every smug smile, every whisper behind raised hands. And then I walked away, the soft rustle of my jacket the only sound marking my departure. I left the ballroom, leaving behind the laughter, the lights, the orchestrated celebration of my downfall. Outside, the late spring air felt sharp against my skin, cleansing in its indifference. I paused on the front steps, inhaling deeply, willing my mind to clear and my heart to harden. The night had shattered everything I had believed true, but in that fracture lay the first crack in the armor of my betrayers, and the spark of a reckoning yet to come. When I woke the next morning, the sun was already streaking gold across my bedroom ceiling, but inside me only darkness pulsed. My head throbbed with memory's aftermath, the ballroom, my brother's triumphant toast, Amara's revelation. I sat up slowly, brushing my fingers across the rumpled sheets, as though I might clutch some comfort in their tangled cotton. The silence of our home felt foreign, oppressive, as if every wall had gathered to judge my shame. My phone buzzed twice on the nightstand, once with an email notification from our company's board, once with a text from Roman reading, "Congrats again. Welcome to the family." I stared at the messages, while rising in my throat, and shut off the phone before I could respond. I needed time to breathe, time to think, time to mourn the life I thought I had. When I finally padded into the kitchen, the usual hum of the refrigerator and drip of the faucet seemed too mundane for my upheaval. I poured coffee in a daze, the bitterness grounding me even as my mind drifted to every cruel glint I'd seen in Amara's eyes the night before. She wore her betrayal with the same grace she wore her designer gowns, each gesture precise, rehearsed. I could almost hear her inner monologue as she addressed the ballroom. "Watch me crush him." Every syllable she spoke played over in my head, fragmenting into memory shards, her steady voice, the way her shoulders remained level, the faint flicker of triumph in her emerald eyes. The paperwork arrived mid-morning on my desk, delivered by a nervous assistant who wouldn't meet my gaze. Company shares here, trust documents there, digital locks activated on my personal files, every corner of my inheritance already resculpted to exclude my name. The letterhead still bore the Ridgewood Holdings crest, but beneath its elegant typography, it felt like the signature of my own erasure. I looked at the fine print, studying each clause, each revocation. 3 weeks ago, I had signed away everything while fevered and vulnerable. She had orchestrated it all. The sickness, the signing, the announcement. It was meticulous, cold, and impossible to believe I'd been such a fool. I should have felt rage boil over, but instead a slow burn ignited in my chest, a quiet determination I didn't know I possessed. I realized that the real mask Amara wore wasn't her polished smile, but the one I'd worn for our marriage, the blinders of trust, the denial of any discord beneath the surface. I had believed, and in doing so, blinded myself to every warning sign. But if she could plan such a betrayal so deeply, she also feared something, perhaps the strength I would find in my own silence. They had bet on my collapse. I refused to give them the spectacle they craved. By midday, I forced myself to shower, to dress in a crisp white shirt and dark trousers as though I were stepping into a boardroom rather than into the ruins of my life. I drove to the office with hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened. The city passed by in a blur of traffic lights and glass towers. Even the familiar skyline felt alien. At the building's entrance, my ID badge failed. The scanner's red glow final and absolute. The security guard, his posture stiff, said quietly, "Your access was revoked, sir." I nodded, swallowing past the lump in my throat. I crossed into the lobby without a fight, determined to claim whatever dignity remained. Inside the executive suite, I found my office sealed, its frosted glass door replaced with a solid panel bearing a new nameplate, Lance Beckford, my former assistant whom I had dismissed months earlier for leaking files. His smirk as I approached stabbed at me, each corner of his mouth a silent taunt. He leaned back in my leather chair, arms crossed, as though I were the intruder. "Welcome back," he drawled, voice oily with false congeniality. "We're moving in a new direction." Behind him, Amara emerged from the conference room, her posture flawless, her smile perfectly painted. The two of them formed a tableau of conspiracy, and I felt the weight of every lie that had led me to this moment. I stood in the doorway, chest tight, mind racing. The office I had built, the empire my father entrusted to me, had been wrested from my control. This was their coup de grace, the final act of humiliation, but I noticed something in Amara's eyes. A flicker of hesitation when she saw my expression, a microsecond where her composure cracked. I seized on it, letting my own calm solidify into resolve. "You should have read the documents before signing," I said, voice steady. Each word landed like a hammer blow. Lance's smirk faltered, Amara's smile froze. They had assumed my confusion would be eternal. They underestimated my will. "I'm not here alone," I continued, stepping fully into the room. "I've retained counsel, and I have a witness." I watched Amara's mask slip just enough for me to see the first real tremor of fear. I felt strength rise in me, not from the office chair I once occupied, but from the truth at my back. "We have proof," I said, producing a folder of emails and recordings from my jacket. "And we'll use it." Their eyes widened at the sight of evidence they hadn't counted on. In that instant, the power shifted. They realized that their plan to break me in public had forged instead the steel of my determination. I turned and walked out, leaving them to process their surprise. Through the corridor's muted lighting, I breathed deeply. I felt the first stirrings of purpose crawl through my veins. They had stripped me of title and privilege, but they had not touched my resolve. Their mask of control would crumble under the weight of truth, and I would be the one to shatter it. I stumbled from the car into the warm glow of Aunt Noelle's porch light, heart pounding like a drumbeat of desperation. The night air had failed to cool the furnace of betrayal that roared inside me. I pressed the doorbell and waited, each chime echoing in my chest until the door swung open and Aunt Noelle enveloped me in a fierce embrace. Her arms were the only shelter I'd known since childhood storms, and in that moment I surrendered to the tremor that racked my body. She led me inside without a word, guiding me through the familiar corridor lined with family portraits. My father's stern smile, my grandmother's soft gaze, moments of happiness I had once taken for granted. Now those images seemed like relics of a world I'd lost. She didn't ask questions as she settled me on the plush sofa in her study. Instead, she produced an old leather-bound folder stamped with my father's seal. "He wanted you to have this if anything ever happened," she said quietly, her eyes reflecting sorrow and determination. I opened it with trembling fingers to find a meticulous assortment of trust documents, ownership clauses, and my father's will. The pages crackled like dry leaves underfoot, and I read until the room blurred, gripping the leather cover as though it were a lifeline. Then I came to the clause that felt like a second betrayal. If my son marries before age 35, he must retain sole ownership of Ridgewood Holdings or forfeit his rights entirely. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that my father had anticipated interference. He had seen the threat before I had. Aunt Noelle's voice pulled me back. "He told me to guard it, but only give it to you if you ever needed proof." She looked at me steadily, as though weighing the weight of her trust against my wounds. "He knew someone would try to take everything from you." The words were soft, but they struck me like a thunderclap. Amara had known about this clause. Roman had known. They had planned their coup with the precision of chess masters, corrupting the very safeguards my father put in place. The betrayal was deeper than I'd dared imagine. It was a crime of premeditation, a conspiracy to strip me of both love and legacy. Anger surged through me, sharp and searing. I felt it twist around the tendrils of grief, hardening into resolve. "They weren't just taking my wife," I whispered, voice tight. "They were trying to steal my father's life's work." Aunt Noelle nodded and rose, crossing to her desk to reach for a small key. She unlocked a drawer and withdrew an envelope marked "For Caleb, Elmwood Ventures." Confusion knotted my brow. Elmwood Ventures was the partner firm where my father held silent shares, an entity so discreet that only a handful of trusted associates knew of its existence. "This," she said, sliding the envelope toward me, "is how Dad kept you in control, no matter what." I lifted the flap and found documents revealing that Elmwood held a majority stake in Ridgewood through a web of subsidiaries. My father's foresight had created a secret lifeline, a hidden fortress under the company's outward structure. A gasp escaped me as I realized the full scope of his plan. He anticipated direct attacks on my competence, my sanity, and even my marital status, and he built a refuge against each. As I traced the lines of shareholder percentages with my finger, the cold logic of his safeguard made me feel both betrayed by his secrecy and grateful for his protection. Aunt Noelle sat back down and regarded me with gentle severity. "I warned you about Amara," she said. "I told you to watch for shadows behind her smile." I closed the folder, the truth settling like polished stone in my gut. I had ignored the cautionary whispers because I didn't want to see them as betrayal. I had seen them as small imperfections, easily overlooked in the glow of love. But now those shadows had become weapons. And now I held the tool to expose them. The first tendrils of a plan began to take shape in my mind. I would not rush to confrontation. Impulsive fury had undone many a righteous cause. Instead, I would gather allies and evidence, assemble every piece of proof that Talia, the former project manager, had unearthed, and combine it with these documents. I would expose Amara and Roman in full daylight, shatter their web of lies, and reclaim what my father had built and what they had tried to steal. I felt a measure of peace as the adrenaline ebbed, replaced by a calculated calm. A flash of gratitude for my aunt's unwavering loyalty warmed me. She had stood by me when others had folded, preserving these documents like sacred artifacts. She'd been the last bastion of truth in a sea of deception. And now, armed with her courage and my father's foresight, I would turn the tables. I stood, folding the leather folder and envelope neatly under my arm. Aunt Noelle met my gaze, pride and concern dancing in her eyes. "Be careful," she whispered. "They're desperate." I nodded, steeling myself. "So am I." As I stepped back out into the night, the moonlight seemed sharper, the world more defined. The betrayal that had once splintered my faith now served as a crystal lens, focusing my will into an unbreakable point. I would not let Amara's smile or Roman's smirk stand. I would not cower while they rewrote my future. I was armed with truth, shielded by my father's wisdom, and guided by the only family member who had ever truly believed in me. The echoes of the ballroom faded behind me, replaced by the steady rhythm of my footsteps and the quiet promise of restitution. The last person I could trust had given me everything I needed to fight back, and I intended to win. I walked into the Ridgewood Holdings lobby the next morning with the weight of a man who'd already lost everything. But nothing could have braced me for the scanner's red glow. My badge, my name, blinked access denied. The front desk guard, a young woman whose name I'd never learned, glanced up and then away, her eyes apologetic but resolute. "Your access was revoked, sir," she murmured, her voice a soft blade slicing through what remained of my composure. I nodded, already bracing for the spectacle awaiting me inside. Every heartbeat felt like thunder as I stepped past the glass doors, the seismic shift in my life humming through the polished marble. In the corridor outside my office, I paused to steady my breath. The morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the swirls of dust dancing in the air, but I refused to let it blind me. This building had been my fortress, the place where I'd spent late nights drafting growth plans, closing deals, and nurturing the company my father had entrusted to me. Now it felt like a gilded cage, each steel beam enclosing me in a betrayal so intimate it made my skin crawl. I reached for the door handle, only to find the glass panel replaced with a solid sheet bearing a new nameplate. Mr. Lance Beckford, it read. My heart constricted, a vice of fury squeezing tighter with each breath. Lance, the assistant I'd fired for leaking sensitive files, a small betrayal at the time, eclipsed by my faith in him as an eager protege. Now he sat in my chair, smirking like a triumphant invader. I raised my chin and stepped inside. Beckford swiveled slowly in the plush leather chair, arms crossed, eyes cool as ice. His tailored suit looked fresh, his smile predatory. "Welcome," he drawled, voice heavy with false warmth. "We're moving in a new direction." Every word felt rehearsed, like a line in a play where I was not meant to have the final act. The office smelled of expensive cologne, stale coffee, and the faint whiff of defeat. I let the silence stretch, letting Beckford's arrogance fill the room until it became unbearable. Finally, I spoke, voice low. "Tell me about this new direction." He leaned forward, tapping a strewn pile of papers on the desk. "Management decided it's time for fresh leadership. He paused, savoring the moment. "Well, you're out." He chuckled. "Amara always said you needed some time off. Thought this transition would be gentler if handled behind the scenes." My stomach churned at the name Amara, her betrayal cloaked in faux concern. I clenched my fists to keep from striking him. Instead, I surveyed the office that had once been mine, family photos on the credenza, a half-finished model of our newest development on the shelf, the oversized mahogany desk I'd picked out with my father's blessing. All of it now felt like the set of someone else's success story. I took a slow breath, drawing strength from the last embers of calm I could find. Every eye in the building, every board member, every manager, every security guard had participated in this coup. But they had underestimated one thing: my reluctance to play the victim. I squared my shoulders and met Beckford's gaze. "You made a tactical error." My voice carried, filling the room. "You forgot to check the clause." His smirk faltered. I saw the recognition flicker in his eyes, the first crack in his confidence. "Clause," he echoed. I reached into my blazer pocket, feeling the cool edge of the leather folder that Aunt Noelle had entrusted to me. I dropped it onto the desk with a soft thud. Papers fanned out, legal documents, trust agreements, and, most importantly, the will stipulating that if I married before 35, I would lose nothing so long as I maintained sole ownership of Ridgewood Holdings. I let the silence speak as he rifled through the pages, each turn of paper and nail in the coffin of their stolen power. Beckford's face paled. This can't be real," he stammered. I leaned forward. "It's very real. You never saw this coming because you didn't think to question me fully. You assumed I'd collapse." I pressed the folder toward him. "Consider this your notice." At that moment, a familiar voice joined us. Amara glided into the doorway, all poise and silk, but her confident stride faltered when she saw the folder. Rage and fear battled behind her emerald eyes. She raised a perfectly arched brow. "What's this?" I rose, turning to face her and Beckford together. The predator and the pawn. I let the chill settle into my words. "My ownership remains intact," I said, "and I intend to use it." Their coup had been calculated for weeks, months even, but so had my counterstrike. "You'll reinstate my access immediately," I continued, "or I'll file for a restraining order, breach of trust lawsuit, and expose everything." Beckford swallowed. Amara's lips pressed into a thin line. I felt the balance of power shift as they realized that their public ambush had forged instead a weapon in my hands. They had turned my company into a prison, but I held the key. I slipped the folder back into my pocket. "I suggest you reverse this mess before more people learn what you've done." I collected my composure, stepping past them toward the door. As I passed, I stopped at the reception desk, picked up my old smartphone, and handed it to the guard. "Call my lawyer," I said. His eyes widened, but he nodded, fearing the undercurrent of menace in my calm, "and schedule a board meeting for tomorrow." In the elevator, the doors slid shut, and I exhaled in a long, shuddering breath. My reflection stared back, etched with betrayal but lit by newfound resolve. The empire my father built was still mine, despite every calculated blow. Their attempt to humiliate me had only steeled my resolve. Ridgewood was no longer a gilded cage, it was an arena. And I would not only reclaim my company, I would reclaim my legacy. As the elevator descended, I felt the pulse of possibility ahead. Tomorrow's board meeting, Amara's downfall, Roman's exposure. The coup had been phase 2 of their plan. Mine was just beginning. When I arrived at the agreed meeting spot, a dimly lit corner table in a nondescript cafe on the edge of the financial district. I was expecting confrontation, perhaps standoffish glances, but nothing prepared me for the quiet determination in Talia's eyes. She sat alone, latte cooling at her elbow, fingers wrapped around the cup as though it were a lifeline. The moment I approached, she stood and offered me a slight nod, her posture guarded yet resolute. I slid into the seat opposite her, the evidence folder tucked under my arm, feeling heavier than any briefcase. My throat was tight, each breath measured, but seeing her there, my supposed adversary turned ally, stirred something like hope in my chest. Her voice was soft but unwavering. "I didn't come here to gloat." She paused, letting her meaning sink in. "I came because I had a choice, stay silent or set things right." She placed a hard drive on the table between us, its plastic case scuffed, the label reading simply Ridgewood Project Files. I picked it up and felt its weight, both literal and metaphorical. Here lay the ammunition I needed. Talia's role in all this was complex. She'd been a project manager on one of our largest developments, lauded for her competence and creativity. A month before Frederick's stroke, Roman had accused her of breach of loyalty and unceremoniously fired her. The official reason was vague, some mishandled document, they claimed. But the truth I was discovering tonight was that she'd stumbled onto inconsistencies in finances and communications that pointed straight to Roman and Amara's conspiracy. Instead of exposing them, she'd been quietly silenced. I leaned forward, folding my hands around the folder. "Why help me now?" I asked. Her eyes darkened with a flash of pain. Because I was supposed to be you. Roman used me first, made me sign non-disclosure agreements, told me to stay quiet or my career would be ruined. I refused until they found a reason to fire me. I lost everything because I valued the truth. Her jaw clenched, and I sensed the courage that had driven her risk. I've risked more than you know. Talia slid the hard drive across the table so I could insert it into my laptop. I watched as she retrieved a USB extension cable and plugged it in, the tiny click of connection punctuating the silence. The screen flickered, then filled with folders named emails, voice recordings, meeting notes. These came from my inbox, recordings from conference calls, even text messages between Roman and Amara, she explained. I saved copies before they could delete or alter anything. Under her direction, we clicked through file after file. An email from Roman to Amara read, "He trusts me. I'll get him to sign it." Another contained planning session notes. Phase 1, public humiliation. Phase 2, takeover. My stomach knotted as the sheer scale of their orchestration became undeniable. I closed my eyes for a moment, remembering the spark in Amara's gaze when she announced her engagement to Roman. That spark was schadenfreude at its purest, an expression of victory over the man she once claimed to love. My jaw tightened at the memory. They didn't just betray me. They weaponized me. My hand drifted to the hidden folder Aunt Noelle had given me with the will and trust clauses. Together with Talia's files, I now had a complete dossier on their plan. Talia watched me with sober eyes. "You'll need more than legal documents," she cautioned. "You'll need witnesses who can testify to the meetings, the communications. And you'll need to move fast before they cover their tracks." I nodded, appreciating her strategic mind as much as her courage. She'd studied every piece of evidence, mapped out a timeline of deceit, and identified key people who, once approached, would corroborate the evidence beyond challenge. I already contacted our former CFO, Jacobs. He's willing to speak under oath. She offered a small, hopeful smile. He's upset about the way he was railroaded out. Relief washed through me at the mention of Jacobs. His integrity had been among the few constants in a sea of shifting loyalties. If he stood with us, the board would have to listen. I cracked my knuckles, steeling my resolve. "What's next?" I asked. Talia thumbed through her notes and laid out a plan. First, secure Jacobs' testimony and the hard drive contents with my attorney. Next, serve formal notice of the lawsuit and restraining order. Then, convene an emergency board meeting to present the evidence, ensuring the media was alerted to maintain transparency and prevent Roman from spinning a narrative of his own. Every move had to be calculated, publicized carefully, in time to prevent them from burying the story. As we talked, I realized I was no longer overwhelmed by anger or grief. Instead, I felt purpose, a clarity that had eluded me since the ballroom ambush. Talia's presence, her unwavering support, was a revelation. She was the proof that not all who had been wronged would stay silent. She had been the underdog in the charade, and by revealing her loyalty, she was reclaiming her own dignity and mine. When our meeting ended, we parted with a firm handshake that conveyed more than words ever could. I watched Talia disappear into the night, a figure of resilience against the darkness of deceit. I returned to my car, the hard drive nestled safely in the glove compartment, the folder of trust documents on the passenger seat. The road ahead would be fraught with legal battles, hostile boardrooms, and ruthless opponents. But now I had an ally who understood the stakes, a strategy to follow, and the resolve to see it through. As I drove home, the city lights blurred into streaks of color across the windshield. My mind replayed the steps ahead, aligning evidence, rallying supporters, reclaiming my company, my legacy. And through it all, I carried a newfound respect for Talia, the unexpected ally who stood when everyone else faltered. She reminded me that sometimes the strongest loyalty springs from those who risk everything on a belief in justice. With her by my side, I was ready to expose the truth, dismantle their mask of control, and rise again, no longer as the betrayed heir, but as the leader who refused to be broken. Tonight, the coup would meet its reckoning, and I would stand unbowed. That night, I returned to Aunt Noelle's house under the cloak of late darkness, the cool breeze swirling around me as if pushing me forward. Talia's hard drive, and the damning evidence it contained, rested heavy in my coat pocket, alongside the trust documents that bore my father's final safeguard. I knocked on the door, and Aunt Noelle ushered me inside with a look of weary optimism. The living room lights were dim, the air smelling faintly of lavender, as though she prepared this room for moments just like this. I laid the folder and hard drive on the mahogany coffee table between us, the soft click of their arrival punctuating the silence. Aunt Noelle poured tea for both of us, her hand steady despite the tremor in my own. She watched me with those piercing, compassionate eyes that had seen my childhood triumphs and scars alike. "Show me," she urged. I nodded, lifting the hard drive and explaining, step by step, how Talia had infiltrated their encrypted emails, recorded private strategy sessions, and downloaded text exchanges between Roman and Amara. Aunt Noelle's lips pressed into a thin line as I described their two-phase plan. First, publicly humiliate me at the engagement party to break my spirit. Second, wrest complete control of Ridgewood Holdings by exploiting my vulnerable mental state under the guise of a relapse. They'd thought me ripe for institutionalization, for legal guardianship, for total erasure. Their arrogance tumbled from those files and recordings, each confession more brazen than the last. But the final piece, the inheritance trap, was the keystone of their scheme. I slid my finger to the clause in my father's will. If I married before 35, I retained sole ownership of Ridgewood only so long as I remained competent and single. Otherwise, everything passed to a series of charitable trusts, and then to Roman as alternate heir. They had triggered the clause by orchestrating the announcement and, in their eyes, would finish the job by declaring me unfit. That would have activated an automatic transfer of shares and assets, leaving me penniless. They'd covered every angle. All that remained was to spring their trap and collect their spoils. Aunt Noelle exhaled, brushing a loose strand of silver hair behind her ear. "He thought he was clever," she said softly. "But your father was cleverer." She reached for the envelope labeled Elmwood Ventures and opened it again. "Your father held secret shares through Elmwood, a partner firm no one suspected. That was his emergency clause in case this ever happened." I watched as she removed the share certificates and silent partnership agreements. They granted majority control to Elmwood, and therefore to me, as its sole beneficiary. My heart thundered. This was the lifeline I needed to defy the inheritance trap. I spread the documents across the table, letting the dim lamplight reveal each watermark and signature. "They don't know about this," I murmured. "Roman and Amara never suspected the secondary clause." Aunt Noelle nodded. "They were too busy watching the surface. They didn't dig deeper." I felt a surge of determination. Their plan had been airtight, except for this backup my father had buried in plain sight. It wasn't just a contingency, it was a declaration of faith in me, an unspoken testament that I could weather any storm. We spent hours decoding the legalese and cross-referencing the dates of each document. The timeline was clear. Roman had uncovered the marriage clause months ago. Amara had agreed to become the alternate heir in case of my incompetence, and together they had triggered the clause at the party. The next step would have been to initiate guardianship proceedings within days, all while smearing any attempt I made to contest it as further proof of instability. But with Elmwood's secret shares, I still held a majority stake. I could call a shareholder vote, override their maneuvers, and reclaim Ridgewood from the inside out. Aunt Noelle poured more tea, her expression grave but resolute. "You have the documents, the evidence, and the ally. Now you need the authority." I nodded, tasting the bitter tannins in my mouth, savoring their clarity. "Tomorrow, I file notice of intent to call an emergency shareholders meeting. I'll present the evidence to the board and use Elmwood shares to force a vote of no confidence in Roman and Amara." The words rolled off my tongue, calm and controlled, but underneath them roared the fury I had held at bay for too long. She reached across the table, placing her hand atop mine. "Be careful," she warned. "They will fight back." I squeezed her fingers in gratitude. "I know, but they underestimate me again." Despite the gravity of the situation, a small spark of defiance flared in me. Their plot had been meticulous, but I had the truth, the legal means, and the will to expose them. As midnight approached, we gathered every piece of evidence, emails, recordings, trust documents, share certificates, and organized them into a dossier. I labeled each section: betrayal at the ball, corporate coup, inheritance clause activation, secret shareholding, proposed emergency vote. Each tab felt like a bullet point in the indictment against those who tried to bury me. With the dossier complete, I sealed it in a secure briefcase. Locking it with a key, I slipped into my pocket. Standing at the threshold of Aunt Noelle's porch, I paused. The night was quiet. the sky veiled by clouds that reflected the city lights. I breathed deeply, feeling the gravity of what lay ahead. Exposing a conspiracy of this scale could shatter reputations, dismantle careers, and perhaps harm innocent bystanders. But these were their choices, to gamble everything on my ruin. I would honor my father's legacy by acting not out of vengeance, but out of the integrity he taught me. I would restore Ridgewood, as it was meant to be, and make certain that truth reigned over deception. Aunt Noelle watched me from the doorway, her silhouette framed by the light behind her. "Good luck," she whispered. "Come back victorious." I nodded, stepping into the night, feeling the dossier's weight as a promise of justice. Tomorrow, the inheritance trap would be revealed, and Ridgewood Holdings would survive, not because of secrets or lies, but because of the unbreakable bond of truth between a father and his son. I sat at my kitchen table, laptop open, coffee gone cold at my elbow, heart pounding with the weight of what I was about to do. Dawn was breaking beyond the window, pale light creeping into the room like a hesitant witness. The hard drive Talia had provided lay open on the counter, its digital contents spread like evidence in a courtroom. I stared down at the video montage I had pieced together, a concise, devastating sequence of betrayal, and felt a surge of resolve. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about exposing a conspiracy that threatened the very foundation of our family legacy and the company my father built from the ground up. First, I arranged the clips in order. Roman's clipped whisper, "He'll crack." He always does, recorded during a strategy call. Amara's cool gaze as she slid the papers across my hospital bed, saying he was drugged. He won't even remember. The recording of their private planning session in the boardroom where Amara said, "Let's announce it at the party, it'll humiliate him into silence." Each clip was bordered by a timestamp, a silent testament to their premeditation. I layered in screenshots of the signed documents, the clause from my father's will, and Talia's explanatory text overlay. Finally, I added a brief clip of my own face, steady, unbroken, staring directly into the camera as I stated my intention. They tried to steal my wife and rob me of my legacy. But silence is not consent. I watched the montage in its entirety, feeling a chill as the truth unfolded at the speed of light. The betrayal was stark and undeniable. I saved the final file, encrypting it with a password my attorney would share with trusted board members and the press. Then, with my finger hovering over the post button, I paused to steel myself against the fallout. This would change everything. At precisely 8:47 a.m., I uploaded the video to the company's official social media accounts and emailed links to every journalist who had ever covered our business, financial reporters, tech columnists, and local news anchors alike. The subject line read, "Urgent, Ridgewood Holdings conspiracy exposed." My heartbeat echoed in my ears as I clicked send. For a moment, nothing happened. Then my phone erupted. Notifications flooded in, views skyrocketing, retweets mounting, messages pouring into my inbox. Some supportive, some incredulous, some angry at the audacity of airing family dirty laundry in public. But beneath it all was a single, unmistakable truth. Everyone was watching. Within the hour, Ridgewood's executive line lit up with panicked calls. Board members who had been complicit found themselves cornered by investors demanding explanations. Shareholders called for emergency meetings. The company's PR office released a terse statement acknowledging the video and promising a full investigation. I watched it all unfold from my living room, flanked by Aunt Noelle and Talia via conference call. Their voices buzzed through my laptop speakers, cautious but hopeful. "Told you it would work," Talia said, a hint of triumph in her tone. Aunt Noelle reached over and squeezed my shoulder through the screen. I felt a surge of gratitude for their steadfast support. My father's legacy, and the truth, had ripped through the carefully constructed facade that Roman and Amara had built. The board had no choice but to act. By noon, the board chairman had called an emergency session for the following morning. Roman's office was locked pending further inquiry. Amara's status as trustee was frozen. The news headlines blazed across every financial portal. Airs explosive video shatters Ridgewood Holdings, family feud erupts into public scandal, board calls emergency meeting after betrayal exposed. Even casual scrollers paused to read, the virality undeniable. My phone buzzed again. It was my lawyer, Marcus. "They're calling for you to address the shareholders live at 10 a.m. tomorrow." His voice crackled through the line. "Be prepared." I exhaled slowly, the tension draining from my shoulders. Tomorrow, I would stand before the very group that had tried to oust me, armed with truth and fortified by evidence. I drafted my statement, concise and unflinching. I would thank those who'd stood by the company's values, address the betrayal with clarity, and call for a vote of no confidence in Roman and Amara. Then I'd unveil the fallback. Elmwood Ventures controlling shares, my father's final safeguard, which would restore legitimate leadership and ensure Ridgewood's stability. That evening, I barely slept. My mind raced through every possible scenario. Threats, attempts to discredit Talia, legal counterattacks from Amara's attorneys. But beneath the anxiety was a current of fierce determination. They had gambled on my silence. I had chosen to speak. The next morning, I donned a charcoal gray suit. Nothing flashy, just the uniform of someone who meant business, and rehearsed my speech in front of the bathroom mirror until the words felt like muscle memory. At 9:45 a.m., I entered the boardroom. Journalists crowded the antechamber, cameras rolling. I felt their lenses track me as I strode past, head high, chest open. Inside, the board members sat around the long mahogany table, faces drawn and tense. At the head sat the chairman, eyes flicking between me and the empty seat of Roman's ousted office. The air felt charged, thick with suspicion and anticipation. "Thank you all for gathering on such short notice," I began, voice steady. I felt the weight of every eye on me, but I welcomed it. Yesterday morning, I shared evidence of a conspiracy orchestrated by my brother and my wife. I understand the gravity of airing these matters publicly, but the integrity of Ridgewood Holdings demanded transparency. I paused, letting the room absorb the impact. Today, I present the facts and request your action. With that, I played the video on the large screen behind me. The boardroom fell into hushed silence as Roman's whisper, Amara's confession, and their plotting played out in stark clarity. When it ended, I clicked to show the trust clause in Elmwood Ventures ownership documents. "These confirm my sole rights to Ridgewood Holdings," I said. "I now call for a vote of no confidence in Roman Whitaker and Amara Kenton, effective immediately. Furthermore, I propose appointing interim leadership to guide us through the transition until a full review can be conducted." Hands shot up around the table, first tentative, then resolute. The chairman's gavel tapped once, twice, then dropped on the table. "Motion carried," he declared. Relief and vindication washed through me. The coup had failed. The shadow of betrayal lifted. As I stood to leave, phones flashed, cameras clicked, and I felt the tremor of a new beginning taking hold. I had exposed the conspiracy, reclaimed my legacy, and shown Ridgewood that truth, when wielded with conviction, could topple even the most calculated betrayal. Walking out of that boardroom, I carried the weight of victory and the promise of restoration. The world had seen the depth of their deceit, and now it would witness the strength of my resolve. The video had gone viral, but it was just the opening chapter in Ridgewood's redemption story, one I would lead with honor, transparency, and the unwavering faith in the legacy my father entrusted to me. The morning sunlight felt like a spotlight as I walked into my father's old estate offices, every polished surface and gilt frame a reminder of the legacy Roman thought he'd stolen. I'd arranged to meet Mr. Brenner, my father's longtime associate and keeper of the truly hidden records. Behind his desk lay another envelope, this one marked, "For Caleb's eyes only." When I cracked it open, I discovered the final layer of my father's strategy. Silent holdings in Elmwood Ventures that granted me a majority stake in Ridgewood, regardless of any other clause. I stared at the documents, proof that while Roman had been busy crowing over the visible assets, he'd never suspected the one that mattered most. Brenner settled into his leather chair, folding his hands. "Your father prepared for every outcome," he said, voice low. He knew that his son might face threats from within the family, so he created Elmwood as a backdoor. A way to keep you in control even if the rest of the shares shifted. He tapped the papers. These share certificates aren't recorded in Ridgewood's public filings. Only a handful of people knew of them. Roman isn't one of them. A surge of vindication warmed me. Roman's arrogance had been his undoing. He believed that public power equaled total control. But true control, I realized, lay in the quiet authority of ownership no one else could touch. I gathered the documents, feeling the heft of each page. My father had trusted me to find this fail-safe, to wield it with integrity and restore the company to its rightful course. Armed with Brenner's confirmation, I moved swiftly. I drafted a formal notice to the board, invoking Elmwood's majority stake to call a vote of no confidence in Roman and Amara. Within hours, the notice was delivered to every director and key shareholder, along with redacted summaries of the secret holdings. Whispers spread through the corporate offices like wildfire, security briefings were held, and phone lines buzzed with urgent conversations. Roman's office, already sidelined by the earlier emergency meeting, went silent. He must have realized then that he'd been outmaneuvered at the deepest level. That afternoon, I stood before the board once more, this time armed not only with evidence of conspiracy but with unassailable proof of my commanding shares. The chairman, after consulting his notes, looked up and nodded. "Mr. Whitaker, your Elmwood holdings are validated by the estate lawyer. You have the votes." A single word, adopted, sent a ripple of finality through the room. Roman's name was struck from every document. Amara's trustee role was revoked. In their place, I was appointed interim CEO pending our full strategic review. As the meeting adjourned, I caught my mother's eye across the table. Her expression was unreadable but softened. Perhaps a mixture of guilt and relief. I didn't linger on family drama. There were repairs to make and a company to steady. I stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the estate's manicured gardens, breathing deeply. The weight of betrayal still pressed on me, but beneath it was a firm foundation of authority and purpose. Later, I issued a company-wide statement. Ridgewood Holdings would enter a new era of transparency and renewal, guided by the values my father had instilled. I announced a thorough audit, leadership restructuring, and outreach to employees who'd been caught in the crossfire. The communications team drafted messages emphasizing resilience and unity, while I met one-on-one with senior managers to reassure them of our direction. By evening, the storm had largely passed. Roman, in a final act of desperation, had scheduled a public press conference to deny everything, but it was canceled when his legal team warned him the evidence was overwhelming. Amara retreated from the limelight, her attempts to leverage sympathy falling flat against the overwhelming proof. Their names faded from headlines, replaced by stories of corporate redemption. As I settled into my restored office that night, I paused at my desk and placed the secret share certificates into the top drawer. I sat down, fingers interlacing, and felt a quiet satisfaction, not born of revenge, but of justice served. My father's hidden plan had protected his legacy and his son. Ridgewood was no longer a battleground. It was home, a place where truth had triumphed over deceit. And in that victory, I found a measure of peace. Landing in Montreal felt like stepping into another life, one governed by quiet streets, narrow alleys, and autumn leaves drifting across cobblestone sidewalks. I exited the airport, clutching the leather folder that contained my father's secrets, and hailed a cab. The driver flicked through radio stations before settling on a soft French ballad that haunted the cabin with longing. I leaned back, letting the city's gentle rhythm calm my frayed nerves. I had spent months fighting Roman's betrayal, exposing conspiracies, and reclaiming Ridgewood Holdings. Yet an uncharted chapter awaited me here, finding the daughter my father had never told me existed. Their existence was recorded only in a single will amendment and a letter from Brenner, confirming that Alara, an artist living in Montreal, held 30% of Ridgewood's shares by birthright. Now it was my turn to find her, and to ask her to join me in restoring what was ours. I arrived at the address Brenner provided, a converted loft in the plateau, its red brick facade entwined with ivy and crowned by fire escapes. Inside, the space was flooded with soft light cutting through tall windows. Canvases leaned against walls, paint tubes and brushes lay scattered like confessions of creativity. I waited in the living room, hard hammering, until a slender figure appeared in the doorway. She wore paint-splattered jeans, hair pulled back in a loose bun, cheeks dusted with the pastel hues of her latest work. Her eyes, a mirror of my own hazel, widened with curiosity and cautious hope when she saw me holding the folder. "Alara Whitaker?" I asked, striving for calm. She nodded, voice quiet but steady. "Yes." I held out my hand, but instead of the greeting I expected, she clasped the folder, her fingers tracing the embossed seal of Ridgewood Holdings. "I don't understand," she said softly. "My mother never told me anything about this." Her gaze flicked to the first page of the will, then met mine again, bright and unguarded. 30% of Ridgewood? Why now? I stepped closer, placing the hard-won documents on a low coffee table strewn with charcoal sketches. "Your mother loved you fiercely but never wanted this burden," I began. When my father discovered you, he arranged for a trust to protect your inheritance until the right moment. That moment is now." Tears brightened her eyes, and she sank onto the nearby armchair. I felt a pang of guilt at the thought of her being uprooted by secrets she had no part in creating. "You're telling me I own part of a multinational company?" she whispered. I nodded, drawing out a photo of my father and a young woman, her mother, standing side by side in the Ridgewood foyer. "He wanted to provide for you without disrupting your life," I explained. "But after everything that happened, Roman's coup, Amara's betrayal, I realized that solving Ridgewood's crisis meant embracing its true heirs." I laid out the timeline. My father's long-ago affair, Brenner's discovery, the silent clause, and finally, my brother's desperate bid to preempt your claim. "Roman moved quickly because he didn't know about the silent holdings," I said. "You did nothing wrong, yet you were almost erased." Alara listened, absorbing each detail as though piecing together a puzzle of her identity. When I finished, she closed her eyes, the weight of revelations pressing gently upon her shoulders. "I need time," she said at last. "This changes everything." I conceded the point. No one could leap from artist to corporate heir without space to breathe. We spent the afternoon walking through the plateau, passing open-air markets and street musicians, as I answered her questions about Ridgewood's mission, its people, and the values my father had championed. She asked about our philanthropic arm, the foundations we supported, and the communities we served, her compassionate instincts already aligning with the vision I described. By evening, her resolve had taken shape. Back at her loft, Alara paused before a large canvas, paintbrush in hand. The half-finished portrait showed two figures, one male, one female, standing on a rooftop overlooking a cityscape. "This is us," she murmured, turning to meet my gaze. I was painting my mother's dream of a new skyline, a fresh start. She set the brush aside and offered me a nod that spoke of partnership. "I'll join you," she said. "Not for the money, but for what we can build together." My chest tightened with gratitude and relief. In that moment, the years of struggle, the sharp pang of betrayal, and the brutal boardroom battles crystallized into a singular truth. Family wasn't just blood, but the shared commitment to honor a legacy. Over the next days, we formalized her position. I introduced her to the board via video conference. Her sincerity, combined with her fresh perspective, earned immediate respect. We announced her as co-heir and co-CEO, emphasizing the company's new direction under our joint leadership. Investors, in turn, responded with cautious optimism. Clients praised the unity of purpose. A media statement celebrated the family's reunion, highlighting Alara's artistic background as emblematic of Ridgewood's creative spirit. And as public sentiment shifted toward empathy and admiration, Roman's fraudulent charges and Amara's lawsuits faded into footnotes. Before leaving Montreal, Alara and I stood on her rooftop terrace, the city lights shimmering below like 1,000 promises. She held a glass of sparkling water in her hand and toasted silently to the night. I raised my own glass and said, "To truth, to legacy, and to new beginnings." She smiled, that same quiet strength shining in her eyes, and replied, "To rebuilding what was broken." The wind carried the city's distant hum as if applauding our pact. Flying home, I felt a profound sense of completion, of having honored my father's intentions and having welcomed the missing piece of his legacy. Alara would bring compassion and creativity to Ridgewood Holdings, and together we would ensure that the company rose on truth rather than deception. Roman's schemes lay in ruins, and Amara's manipulations dissolved in the light of exposure. But most importantly, I had discovered the sister I never knew I needed, and in doing so, found the greatest strength in restoration. As the plane soared toward home, I closed my eyes and allowed hope to fill me, certain that the true heir was now by my side, ready to guide Ridgewood into its most magnificent era yet. The morning of our first joint shareholders' gala dawned clear and cool, the sky an unblemished canvas of pale blue. I stood behind the curtain in the grand ballroom, adjusting my tie with calm precision, though my heart fluttered with anticipation. Beside me, Alara smoothed the hem of her emerald green dress. A direct echo of her mother's favorite color, her paint-stained hands now steady and assured. For years, I had imagined reclaiming Ridgewood Holdings in solitary triumph. Today, I would share that victory with my sister, the missing piece of our family legacy. Together, we would usher in an era defined not by secrecy or betrayal, but by truth, collaboration, and integrity. We stepped onto the raised dais to polite applause, the room filled with board members, investors, and employees who had weathered our tumultuous months of upheaval. Under the glittering crystal chandelier, the polished wood floors gleamed, reflecting the pride in my chest. I glanced at Alara, whose quiet smile grounded me. Her presence was a living testament to my father's foresight. He had built not just a company, but a lineage that could endure any storm. Today, that lineage would guide Ridgewood forward. I leaned into the microphone, voice steady. Thank you all for joining us as we mark a new chapter in Ridgewood Holdings' history. When I returned to these halls months ago, I faced the greatest betrayal imaginable. My brother and my wife conspired to strip me of everything my father built. But thanks to your unwavering support and the courage of those who stood by truth, we have prevailed. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. I allowed myself a small nod of gratitude. Alara stepped forward then, her voice soft but resonant. As many of you know, I discovered only recently that I, too, am an heir to our father's legacy. Your warmth and acceptance have made me feel at home among you. Together, Caleb and I will honor the values our father stood for: innovation with integrity, growth balanced by compassion, and leadership guided by transparency. She paused, eyes sweeping the room. Our vision for Ridgewood is not simply to build structures or portfolios, but to build communities, environments where our employees, partners, and neighbors can thrive. We commit to open communication, ethical stewardship, and social responsibility in every endeavor. Applause bloomed like spring flowers. I swallowed past the lump in my throat, pride tinctured with hope. The era of clandestine clauses and hidden trust was over. In its place was a partnership grounded in honesty. My mind flicked back to Roman's arrogant smirk, to Amara's theatrical betrayals. Those memories felt distant now, eclipsed by the promise of this moment. A company reborn under the banner of family unity. After our remarks, the gala moved into a reception. I circulated among the guests, shaking hands and offering genuine smiles. Managers I had once thought lost to fear approached me with renewed energy, their eyes bright with the knowledge that leadership had returned to capable, principled hands. A young analyst named Priya thanked me for restoring stability, her gratitude so earnest it brought warmth to my chest. I paused to reassure her that her insights would have an even greater role in shaping our future. Across the room, Alara talked quietly with long-tenured employees, her empathy evident in every nod and empathetic word. When the dining service began, I joined Alara at the head table. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight, and servers glided between tables bearing platters of seasonal dishes. I raised my glass, white wine, and caught Alara's eye. To new beginnings, I toasted softly. She returned the gesture, her gaze steady. To family, she added, and our glasses chimed gently. In that simple moment, I felt the healing of old wounds. Later, as dessert was served, a delicate souffle with berries, Alara and I slipped away from the crowd. We found ourselves on a balcony overlooking the city skyline, the air carrying the faint hum of traffic below. The dusk sky blushed pink and lavender, a fitting backdrop for this twilight of conflict and dawn of collaboration. She leaned on the railing, looking out at the lights. It feels surreal, she admitted, voice low. One day, I was painting by candlelight. The next, I'm co-leading one of the region's largest firms. I rested a hand on her shoulder. You earned this, I said. Your honesty, your compassion, they're precisely what Ridgewood needs. My father would be proud of you. She smiled, and for an instant, I saw my mother's face in hers. We both stand on his shoulders, she said. It's our turn to look forward. The gala wound down with dancing and laughter, the earlier tension replaced by collaboration and optimism. As I watched employees from every level celebrate, I understood that the true victory lay not in ousting Roman or exposing conspirators, but in restoring faith in leadership, in the company, and most importantly, in one another. I realized that the real restoration of Ridgewood would be a continuous journey, guided by the principle that transparency must never again be compromised. Before the night ended, Alara and I returned to the dais for a final bow. The audience rose in unified applause, genuine and heartfelt. I felt the rhythm of their approval, a pulse that resonated deep within me. In that moment, I knew we had succeeded. We had reclaimed not only Ridgewood's assets, but its soul. Walking back into the ballroom one last time, hand in hand with my sister, I felt an overwhelming gratitude for the path that had led me here, the betrayals that taught me vigilance, the allies who lent me courage, and the secrets that, once uncovered, forged the strongest foundation imaginable. The chandeliers above cast prisms of light across the polished floors, and I allowed myself to believe that those fractured reflections, once broken, could now form a radiant mosaic of our future. As the gala concluded and guests began to depart, I lingered for a moment on the ballroom floor. The chairs had been neatly stacked, the stage cleared, but the echoes of our journey lingered in the air. I closed my eyes, absorbing the silence. Then, with a final breath, I opened my eyes and turned toward the exit, a man renewed, a company reborn, and a family united as they stepped confidently into the new era.